My name is Danny Pitaway. I'm a full-time faculty member at Coastline College, which is in Orange County, California. I am the Student Success Coordinator and also the current SLO Coordinator. And I'm very happy to deliver this presentation with my colleague, Mr. Dr. Aaron Zentner.
Thanks, Danny. My name is Aaron Zettner. I'm the Dean of Institutional Effectiveness, which is one of those catch-alls, which is analytics, research, planning, accreditation, and 5,000 other things, along with SLOs, working in partnership with Danny Pitaway. In addition to that, I'm part-time. Well, my new title is Associate Professor of Data Science at a few universities I'm working at. So thank you again, and it's going to be a fun and I'll say educational experience today, and I'll let Danny kick off the agenda.
Awesome. Thanks, Aaron. So as you can see, we have the title slide up on the screen right now. This presentation is about the history of AI within the context of student learning outcomes, as well as talking about generally sound strategies related to teaching and learning, more specifically culturally relevant instruction in light of the ChatGPT world that we all live in currently. So that being said, this is a brief outline of what we intend to present today. We're going to show some slides to go over the history of AI. We're going to look at that from a couple different angles. We're going to present various scientific breakthroughs and significant moments that have happened in the history of AI. And we're also going to, in tandem, show how AI has factored into popular consciousness through films, arts, and entertainment. We felt it's kind of a fascinating lens to kind of merge the scientific/academic development of AI along with popular conceptions of AI. We're then going to talk about the emergence of ChatGPT as a language learning model. Then we're going to segue into talking about what you could call conscientious consumption of artificial intelligence, which is to say, being cognizant of the boundaries that we may want to place on AI, being aware of safe AI practices and so forth, and the future of AI research. Then we're going to talk about AI within the context of higher education. Basically ChatGPT as a disruptor, but as something that we can incorporate into teaching and learning. And that's going to take us into talking about what is quality teaching, what are quality outcomes, and then some very practical ideas for classroom use. So the next slide here to start the history of AI is really let's get grounded in a definition. What is artificial intelligence? Basically, according to IBM, AI in its simplest form is a field that combines computer science, robust data sets to enable problem solving. Some other concepts that are associated with AI are data science, machine learning, and deep learning. And essentially what I want to impress upon you is that AI systems like ChatGPT are closed systems, whereas a human being is an open system. Okay, so just kind of keep that thought in your mind that AI is a closed system. Actual human beings, sentient beings, are open systems. AI systems are designed to make predictions. They're also designed to organize or classify information. So that kind of harkens a little bit to the point I said earlier about understanding boundaries of what AI actually is and what it isn't.
And so we want to kind of go to the formation of AI. A lot of the times we think like, wow, post COVID, it's AI time. Like it just began. Well, it just began in our lifetime, or maybe the emergence of that concept came towards us. But really looking at the early moments of AI, looking at things such as all the way from the 1791s of the analytical machine, looking at aspects such as what can automate work, how can we move things forward, and then the idea of what is a robot, and then goes to Alan Turing's approach, who was a code breaker and primarily a computer engineer, who posed the concept of can machines think, and really empowering that process of consciousness to a machine. And so we'll pass it to Danny to talk a little bit
Thank,
more, Alan.
thank you, Aaron. Yeah, Dr. Alan Turing is a seminal figure in the history of artificial intelligence. You could consider him to be the progenitor or the creator of modern artificial intelligence concepts. Even though it does AI, history does date back before Alan Turing. But as Aaron said, Dr. Turing really posited a central question that is still relevant today. And he posited this back in, I think it was 1950. Can machines think? And another way to conceptualize Turing's contributions philosophically to the field of AI is to look at something that he called the imitation game. It later became known as the Turing test. It's a very simple philosophical idea illustrated by this graphic that you can see, where you have a person who's labeled with a C behind a wall, and in one room you have a computer that's the labeled with the letter A, and then the other room there's a person which is labeled with the letter B. The idea of the imitation game or the Turing test is that if the human being who's labeled as letter C cannot tell the difference between the computer and the human, then we've really gotten somewhere in terms of artificial intelligence and in terms of answering the question, can machines think? So the idea, again, as you can kind of see represented graphically, is that the person would write a question on a piece of paper, person, with the letter C, basically slip it under the door of office A, and then out comes a response. And then the same thing with room B. That helps nullify whether it's a computer or a person, but the focus is on the quality of the answer. So again, I just wanted to propose this because it's still something that we look at today to understand the sophistication of an AI model, and specifically as we're going to get into with ChatGPT, which is based on as a language learning model, and using very natural sounding language. We felt that the Turing test was just very apropos to help ground this presentation. Oops, let me see what happened there. Oh, it looks like we actually went to the link. Excuse me for 1 second. Let me fix my presentation.
We should have had AI been running this.
Well, I've cited every image in the thing and it's linked. So, oh, I did it again.
And,
Okay.
and so while Danny's pulling this up, a thing that we would like to mention is there may be questions, there may be conversations we may want to have, and I would recommend we have that at the end of the presentation because we're going to be covering a broad brush or survey of not just the history of artificial intelligence, but the applications over time. And I think that would maybe lend itself to a richer conversation at the end. So, but if you do have questions in chat, you can by all means send it our way. And so what I'm going to touch on a little bit is the first wave of AI development. And so as you've seen historically where it came from, you're watching the progression between the 50s and 60s. Now the 50s and 60s, there was a big emerging trend. There was a excitement about it. And you're seeing as you start looking at some of the sources that we're using, it's primarily listed within higher education in universities and university research, not so much pushed out to the public mainstream that you may see as state with OpenAI and the like. But as we start looking, you start how does artificial intelligence grow over time? And then primarily looking at the first chatbot, that first interaction between humans based on what we call large data systems of information. And there was a lot of aspiration behind this, a lot of funding behind this to say, how can we create like a system where we can coexist and work and make life easier for maybe the more of the mundane projects that were happening at that point in time, and how can AI support this? And then while it was in the realm of academia, mainstream started to pick up this concept and push it towards media, and Daniel showed a little bit about that.
So right on the heels of the scientific breakthrough of having a language chatbot comes Stanley Kubrick's film from 1968, 2001 Space Odyssey, which introduced the first AI character that entered popular consciousness. As you may know, if you've seen the film, HAL 9000, we have a quote there from HAL. I know that you and Frank were planning to disconnect me, and I'm afraid that's something I cannot allow to happen. So in the film, we have a computer essentially coming to life and making decisions for itself. I mention this because I think it's important to understand the in tandem development of scientific breakthroughs and how that those same breakthroughs are then represented in arts and entertainment and popular culture. It says a lot to acknowledge the fact that we were aware that we were creating a technology that may in some ways rival or challenge the very way that we live, right? And so just wanted to introduce that as well.
And so on the heels of that, we've come into something called the AI winter. So think about when something goes really viral and it's super popular and you're like, this is the best. You're living your best life with that. And then it just goes away. Think about AI like that. It reached its peak. Everybody had such aspirations like this is going to go somewhere. This is going to change our lives. The robots are going to vacuum my floor. That was way before iRobot. But then reality kicked in. Reality kicked in to the fact that one, AI is really expensive to do. Second, back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, their computers weren't that good. And so thinking about that, AI had a limitation, not a limitation because it was focused on we didn't have aspirations. It focused on the limitation of resources, computing power, access to data, utilization of that, bringing it to market is what we would call it, or economy of scale, where you would have to have an entire room. If any of you remember seeing this in like textbooks, like, hey, this computer added 1 plus 1, and the computer's like the size of the room. Think about that, where that computing power just to do that basic thing, and then concerning AI and all the information and data that's used to empower that wasn't available at that time. Based on that, the funders of AI, primarily which came out of Britain, said, okay, we're not seeing this reach the scale that we thought it would be. And I think they thought it more of it was like an Olympic runner, like, oh my gosh, we're going to go past everyone, we're going to win the race of life. And then they found out they were taking baby steps and they're like, let's go invest in something else. And that turned into the downturn, which went from the 70s, 80s, and even early 90s of AI. So that mixed with maybe some social fear of loss of control and the like with AI limited its progression forward. So you want to go ahead, Dan?
So again, to give a little bit of a context here, in the 1950s and 60s, we were advancing very rapidly with the development of AI technology. Then there was a great slowdown in the 70s. Then in the early 80s, there was a significant breakthrough. I'm not going to go too into detail about this, but I just wanted to introduce the concept and this image that you can see of what's called a neural network, which is the idea that we started to be able to create computers that were structured similar to how we believe organisms actually think and how our brains are actually structured, in order, to accomplish things like parallel processing and very advanced logic switching decision making. So basically, there was something called the Hopfield neural network that was developed and codified in 1982 that really set the foundation for even the present day how large AI systems are programmed and coded. I want to mention at this early stage, there's a specific algorithm that ChatGPT uses that we're going to talk about later that helps us understand the limitations or boundaries, if you will, of what it can do and how to use it appropriately. That algorithm is called back propagation. I'm going to talk about it later, but I just want to introduce the term at this time. This next slide again kind of harkens back to images that filter through our popular consciousness and popular media culture. As the 80s and 90s progressed, film-going audiences found it equally as fascinating to continue to be enthralled by concepts of what it means to be living in a world where AI technology is rapidly developing. So you may recognize some of the images here, Tron, the first Terminator film, and The Matrix, all of which actually ask very deep philosophical questions about human beings coexisting with artificial intelligence and what it all means.
And so then we come to the magical thing in the last few years called ChatGPT. And as you've seen, ChatGPT, Bard, so many other platforms that have come out, which are GPTs or transformer models. Transformer models were introduced a few years back by Google on how they could help generate an interaction. We try to look at ChatGPT as a way of how you take all of this data, and we'll go into that a little further in the next slide, but to create a conversational piece or generate new information based on information that exists. And what we try to spell here in kind of a nutshell is how would you use a chat GPT, kind of like a Google that you would interact with. So Google's more of a search engine that utilizes a large database and array of landing spaces. But the GPT actually regenerates that based on the connection of words. If you want to forward it to the next slide, we'll go in a little bit deeper into that about what is a transformer. And while I've maybe didn't preface this, there's a lot of narrative on our screens. Typically, Danny and I put like a picture, and that's our entire slide. but we wanted you to leverage this as a resource. So that's why we sometimes put like a novel on one slide or another. So again, I'm not going to read line by line to this, but the main points that I wanted to focus on is really looking at an LLM model focuses on pre-trained information that is based on tons and tons of data. And just like anything with research or data, your responses are only good as your source. And as we go further into that with how people are scrutinizing ChatGPT and GPT models all the way from 2.53, 3.54, and the newest version that's coming out 4.4 and 5 next year, what makes up that model? How is it self-trained? And so historically, it's been trained on different data sets, the Wikipedias, the Reddits, and the like, where data could be accurate, but sometimes may not be on books that haven't been published. And now that they've connected to things like the internet into broader sources, and now we can connect it into more accurate sources, such as research journals, so on and so forth, what it does is not just regurgitates information that exists there, but based on its understanding of the information provided, reconnects it and weaves it back together to give you an answer based on the variances of the information and the questions you ask. Again, Danny will be covering a little bit of that, and I'll talk a little bit later about how to ask the right question, but primarily for the main point of this is historically it's built on a few what we call sorry what we call parameters are basically modeled out information. It's based off of a couple million. Now it's based on 1.7 trillion. So that's pretty large as far as the complexity and depth. And so you'll see that in a couple examples that we give of when we asked something a year ago and when we asked something yesterday, what it looks like. So Danny, if you'd like to carry forward.
Thank you. Yes. So in this slide, we just wanted to present a little bit of resistance, or what you could call a very critical approach to this emerging technology. Many of you may be familiar with Noam Chomsky, a famed linguist, researcher, political scholar. In a recent talk delivered in 2022, and we know that we're in 2024 right now, and AI development is very rapid. So he gave this talk at a conference that was just before ChatGPT was publicly released. But basically, in Dr. Chomsky's position, his opinion is he felt that ChatGPT is essentially useless. That it's basically, you can see a quote there, that it does not contribute anything to society except helping a student fake their way through an exam. He goes on to talk about the role of science and engineering as being useful things for society, whereas science is the development and articulation of key concepts, and engineering is the creation of actual products that are the application of scientific principles. And he further posited that he felt at the time anyway that no matter how complex ChatGPT gets, it simply won't help or change his mind of what it is. Now, we're not here to agree or disagree with Chomsky, just to present the concept, that the idea that there is critical reception, there is critical resistance to these tools. And I think that as with anything, when you're trying to understand and explore a concept, you want to understand the pros and cons. You want to look at the audience that is for the technology, the audience that may think the technology is not useful, to get a fuller picture of what you're dealing with.
And so while that was kind of in their forethoughts is, AI for good, AI for X, Y, and Z, making life better. There are also limitations or boundaries that we have to think about that need to be corralled with AI. So, for example, around 6 or 7 months ago, a big story just came out, and the story was from Digital Trends and other places. The FBI has now warned how AI has been used to make viruses, used to make malware, used to do things that it wasn't really intended for. And so then some papers started coming out, and some leaders outside of higher education, but primarily in industry, were saying, pump the brakes a little bit on AI. What we're seeing is that it's becoming too powerful too fast, because historically you may just have a group of data scientists like putting together these algorithms creating this, but then once OpenAI came out and everybody had access to it, there was a variety of ways, and we'll talk about what we've already created at Coastline, on how you can leverage AI. And so I think because it's been rapidly moving so quickly, they wanted to reduce that speed to market to help understand and set the parameters to ensure safety, security, and responsibility with AI. As while things may have good intention, they may have maybe not as positive outcomes. And so that's really where policy is coming in, not just here, but across the world. On some places have banned it, some places have adopted it, but with parameters. And then we have to think about that through the lens of higher education, which many of our institutions, again, that would be a great debate for another day, or if we end early, on what parameters we set. But just wanted to follow in the suit of Danny, who was talking about there's naysayers, there's for it, and then there's, if they're for it, how do you corral it?
There's also, a very palpable, a very real concern, or maybe even fear, that we rightly should have about what we're creating, about what this is. This is also why I inserted those slides earlier about the representation of artificial intelligence in popular films and arts and entertainment. And many of those films portray AI as something that is potentially an enemy to humankind. Um, this slide here shows the very real reality of where we are at the present day in terms of trying to be very cautious and careful about what we're developing and what its potentials are. This next slide, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to talk a little bit about backpropagation. Again, I don't want to get too computer sciencey in the presentation, but essentially this aspect I feel as an educator is very helpful to understand. Um, this is also a very dense slide, so please, the intent is not for you to try to read it right now on the screen, but to make this slide deck available as a resource afterward for consideration. Essentially, what backpropagation is, okay, so ChatGPT, think of it as a very large database, right? A lot of information has been input into it. And let's say that you ask ChatGPT a question such as, what happens if I break a mirror? Now, what backpropagation does is it sorts through all the information that it has and it tries to give you the answer that is most prevalent or most prominent from the data set that it has. So, in the realm of talking about broken mirrors and in the information that was put into ChatGPT, it has a preponderance of data related to superstition, 7 years of bad luck, these cultural notions that have developed about, what happens when you break a mirror. There's more information about that than there is about the actual physics aspects of breaking a mirror and the refractive properties of light and what that all means. So that's all to say that when you ask ChatGPT a question, and I'll say if you ask it an unrefined question that doesn't have a lot of specific parameters, it's going to give you a simple answer based on the volume of data of however it leans. It ethically may not be right, it may not be wrong, but it's something to be aware of because this is part of where bias can come into an AI system if it uses backpropagation as an algorithm, which again just means it's going to lean towards the largest amount of data that it has. That's why if you ask it very basic questions about, you know, when did World War II start, or when did World War I end, it will probably deliver something factual. But if you ask it a very nuanced, highly specific historical detail question, you may or may not get an accurate information because it's relying solely on what was input into it. Again, as I mentioned at the top of the presentation, AI systems like ChatGPT are closed systems. They can't really create anything new. They rely on what they were given, and they recombine and classify and predict. But anyway, I just thought again, as an educator, it's helpful to try to understand backpropagation as a source of how information is delivered by ChatGPT.
So when we think about other disruptive technologies, primarily in higher education, if you recall, well, none of us could probably recall like when abacuses were there, and then how did calculators come about? They were just there. And when Excel came out, and like, you can't use that. What do you mean? You have to handwrite, or in Microsoft Word, like spell check, like is that allowed? Or Britannica, or even Wikipedia, where it came out. And how disruptive technologies work is, and I'll just give you a short history. My PhD area is in that area in disruptive technology, and the first iteration, like think about your iPhone one. Would you ever use that today? Probably not. Probably never. Not even to, like, I don't know, stop your door. And think about that with these technologies, especially like Wikipedia, where like this is just opinion, this is not meaningful. As those different technologies, tools, and the like continue to advance, they actually become meaningful. I'm not saying Wikipedia is meaningful, but what I'm saying is that they start to grow and become more mainstream, become at scale, become refined. Some go away, but similar to your like iPhone 15 now, it's much more advanced than the first iteration. And that's where we kind of see AI, where we see, for example, in the system that we have and we're working in now with Zoom, you have a chat feature in Zoom that can gather the information and catch you up on what you may have missed. However, the accuracy of that is probably not that good because it's at the baby steps of things. When we use 1,000 acronyms in higher education and you expect it to be like, again, an Olympian runner, and it's taking like barely walking, that's where it's at. Maybe 2 to 3 years from now, it will be like verbatim and amazing. And so those are some of the things that we really think about when we think about technologies and the emergence and how we can utilize them, where we have many early adopters that are just like, yeah, like I'll go through the errors, I'll deal with it as it comes, where there's others in higher education that may want to have it at full scale, or an iPhone 15, and they're like, okay, I guess I'll go to iPhone 15 from my like phone on the wall. So I think those are the types of things that we all come at things at different levels. And I don't know, Dan, if you want to add a little bit to that.
Well, just essentially that, you know, ChatGPT came on the scene halfway through last academic year. And I could tell you on our campus, as I'm sure on many campuses, there was kind of a level of shock about what do we do? How do we cope with this? But very quickly, we seem to realize that it is just the newest in a long line of disruptive technologies, and that we in higher education always adapt, right? We always adapt to whatever the technology is and whatever the tool is to be able to use it effectively. And so that's why we just wanted to help normalize. We're in January 2024, so I think already we've kind of gotten over that curve of fear of ChatGPT and more towards a more productive stance of how do we actually properly incorporate it. So that's going to take us into the last phase of our presentation, where we're going to talk about ChatGPT within the framework of sound teaching and learning principles. So to start that off, we actually asked ChatGPT, how should college students use it? And the answer it gave back was actually fairly comprehensive, so much so that we decided to create a slide around it. Essentially, the bullet list here shows some of the primary ways that ChatGPT could be used, understanding complex concepts, as a writing aid to some degree, language learning support, research support. It's like having a personalized, customized database that responds to questions you ask, that draws on the research that it has access to. So from an academic standpoint, you can see in this list that these are just basic academic tasks that can be augmented or facilitated by ChatGPT.
And I think, to add to Danny's point, this is a very short list that we provided. What we were given was not just a list, but how it was demonstrated in full detail. But we figured no one wanted to look at a size 8 font slide. So we wanted to dial that back. But even thinking about that at our work and using this tool in complex ways, and thinking through the lens of a student, if you're going to talk about advanced physics, and while you may be like, yeah, I have a PhD, it's easy, maybe it's not easy for the first time someone's seeing it, but they say, hey, could you break this down for me? Maybe more so than a textbook might have, or a video, or even a lecture did. It can add that detail. And so, for a practical example, I'll give everyone is I asked it to describe how do you calculate FTES, full-time equivalent students, as our schools get paid by that, to 5-year-olds. And I got that, and I sent it over to our deans. And now everybody understands how we can calculate FTES. And again, it was really following that logic of how do we break it down to maybe the non-technical users or people who are like 2 or 3 steps away from that. And it's just to help facilitate and strengthen that learning. Go ahead, Danny.
So we now want to segue into talking about sound teaching and learning. I want to preface this first before we get into culturally relevant instruction with this quote from the humanities coordinator for the Orange County Department of Ed. She argues that it's crucial for educators to teach students how to use tools like ChatGPT ethically and responsibly, and that it's also our duty as educators to help surface the biases and the flaws of these systems.
And I think to build on what Danny, if you want to jump back to that, really
Sure.
thinking about what does ethical approaches mean? Thinking about human rights, fostering as our institutions had diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, and accessibility. Thinking about the transparency and accountability of the information it provides or what we're asking. And like I said, we're gonna ping back and forth. Like one of the things that Danny and I put together was a GPT or a system that you can put your narratives in, like your SLOs, your assessments, your narrative to say, hey, could you write this in a more inclusive manner? And we built that GPT based on inclusive and encompassing language to address a variety of biases, direct and indirect. And so we're able to refine the work we're doing to say, hey, that sounds really cool to me, but let me just have a second pair of eyes on that. And it's helped us really refine the work in the development of SLOs, assessments, and even just dialogue between our colleagues.
Okay, so let's segue now into cornerstones of sound teaching and learning. And these concepts that I'm going to touch on are things that we're all familiar with. These are the same concepts that we hear about at conferences that we go to, professional development, professional learning activities that may be on and off your campus, things such as creating an inclusive learning environment, right? Valuing and elevating diverse student voices, experiences, identities, inculcating critical thinking, right? Inculcating a growth mindset. That one's not on the slide, but I have to throw that one in there as well. Valuing or rewarding effort that our students apply. Acknowledging with our students that learning is a site of struggle that's often messy, uncomfortable, disruptive. As I was grappling with coming to terms with what ChatGPT is and the challenges we do face as educators when it does occur that it's used inappropriately, let's say, as to basically create an assignment that may be turned in and not cited properly and things like that. The antidote to that, I strongly believe, and we both believe, are the foundations of what solid teaching and learning looks like. That in your class, if you are creating an environment that is inclusive, that values the students, that really pays attention to the lived experiences of your students, that is a strong way forward to be able to properly integrate ChatGPT, help students use it appropriately, um, while still remaining focused on the learning outcomes of what your class is, what your program is, and what you're trying to accomplish. So really, more than anything, ChatGPT just forces us to continue to grow as educators and to dig even deeper into the concepts and principles that we know are sound, that we know are good, and that we know our students value. This is a quote from Geneva Gay, who helped kind of conceptualize culturally relevant instruction. When academic knowledge and skills are situated within the lived experiences and frames of reference for students, they are more personally meaningful, have higher interest appeal, and are learned more easily and thoroughly. Okay. I want to harken back to something I mentioned earlier about I showed you a slide with Noam Chomsky, and he was very critical. There were some other comments that Chomsky made. He was asked in that same interview, um, what should we do, Dr. Chomsky, within higher education, within colleges and universities, to prevent or to lessen the degree to which students may use something like ChatGPT to cheat? His answer was very simple. He said, make your classes more interesting. He said, if students are interested in what they're learning, they're probably less likely to cheat. So again, that fundamental idea of being interested also connects to the idea of culturally relevant instruction, where you are valuing and understanding and attempting to connect to the experiences of your students. And the more we do that, the better the framework we can create for the appropriate use of tools like ChatGPT. Aaron?
And I think to add on to that, I think in many instances we want to shy away from the utilization of that to create, our relevant instruction or even utilize that through through assessments and the like. And so what we've seen so far through our colleagues and peers and even ourselves in the classroom teaching it is we've used it as a compare and contrast, like write something in this and then have ChatGPT. What's the similarities and differences between what you put, what that put, and how could you strengthen what you found, or how does your approach, your perspective differentiate? So really incorporating it in not as a part of the assignment, but as almost an additional learning tool, understanding that our students are going to be potentially involved with utilizing these tools in the near future in their jobs.
So to just further organize this part of our discussion, when you talk about culturally responsive instruction, whether you are utilizing ChatGPT or not, these four principles shine brightly and shine through. That we want to be creating a welcoming and affirming environment, right? Inclusive, that we maintain high expectations and we maintain the rigor of our instruction, that we keep engendering an inclusive curriculum and assessment method, and that we ourselves continuously engage in ongoing professional learning so that we're always at our best and able to be responsive to our students because they deserve it. So this next slide, basically, I wanted to bring everything back to the world of SLOs and the teaching principles and ChatGPT and everything we're talking about. So as the slide says, more than ever, our learning outcomes that reflect critical thinking, the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, are needed, right? Um, we need to seek to develop assignments and activities that inculcate inclusive, equity-minded critical thinking that speaks to the everyday realities of our students' lives. The more we do this, the better the chance we have to get students to use technologies like ChatGPT responsibly.
And I think to add to that with outcomes, some of the things that, and as faculty, we live in a sphere of our bubbles of expertise, which is great. And sometimes we see, what our resources can do as we develop our course outlines of record. But as working with Danny, how do we continue to strengthen that process? He and I wrote a GPT system where you can put your entire course outline of record in there, upload your course outline record, and say, here are the outcomes. Could you help us refine those outcomes that we've currently written? Can you give us examples or recommendations, promising practices on how we could assess these for meaningful learning as they relate to the objectives? Again, putting that level of detail in there. And we've seen it draft. Now, again, it's a draft that we've refined over time, but draft assessments, SLO refinements, and tying them directly to the objectives so you can see as you're teaching through that objective how you're building that learning and at what level of the Bloom taxonomy. But when building these systems like this, we've taken a lot of time to say, account for this stuff in Bloom's, here's what this means, and really putting our logic and detail to that. And again, this is a tool to help, not to replace the work. And so many of our faculty who are not, elbow deep like Danny may be with SLOs find this very helpful as they go through the curriculum review process and just as almost a side editor to the work that they're doing. And while it's not to replace their critical thinking, analysis, and creativity, it's just to enhance it. And so those are some of the things that we've seen the utilization in our environment for strengthening our work related to outcomes.
So in this next slide, it's a little bit more detail about sound teaching practices within the context of acknowledging and incorporating a tool like ChatGPT. These are principles that existed far before ChatGPT, but they are things that I think resonate even more importantly in light of a tool like ChatGPT. The first point I wanted to discuss is emphasizing process versus product in the development of student assignments, right? Emphasizing the steps that we want students to take in the development of an end product, right? If you have an extensive project, an extensive essay, an extensive research project, right? Students benefit from scaffolding. Earlier this morning in the keynote address, Dr. Campbell was talking about core principles of teaching, and the audience, all of you, surfaced so many key concepts. I think scaffolding was actually the number one that popped up in there. And so again, something like scaffolding and breaking assignments down and helping students achieve milestones as they create a larger assignment, more important than ever in our ChatGPT world in order to help facilitate the appropriate use of ChatGPT. So students are less tempted to use it to develop the final product and pay more attention and are more invested in the process and the development of that product. Second point is we as educators to demystify our academic expertise by viewing students as if they are apprentices and that we are apprenticing them into a field of study, into our field of expertise. Um, some of you may be familiar with the work of Vygotsky, a concept called the zone of proximal development, which is where, as an educator, you seek to present material that is that is that can be grasped by your students, but isn't too far out of their orbit for what they're able to handle. And finding that kind of, you know, spot to operate from is part of the art of being a teacher, is knowing how to connect to your students and how to, move everybody forward without leaving leaving anyone alone or behind. The third point is in doing this, in providing scaffolding, in trying to operate within students' zone of proximal development, is to be conscious of valuing the effort that your students apply, right? If you find ways to acknowledge the level of effort they've applied, that goes a long way in the service also of reducing or mitigating incidents of misuse of ChatGPT, when students really feel rewarded and valued for the level of effort that they apply. And that kind of harkens back to emphasizing process over product. If we as educators pay attention to the process that students are following, then again, they may be less likely to take shortcuts to get to an end product. Okay, a lot of this idea comes from Carol Dweck, again, a growth mindset. Um, at this point, we're getting near the end. I think we just have a couple more slides. So these are just some summations of how to consider ChatGPT within our classroom frameworks. And ChatGPT is not a substitute for actual studying and learning content. It is a supplement. It is an aid. It is like having access to a automated learning assistance platform, but it does not replace the hard work that must be done. As I've been saying, we want to value the effort that we expect from students. Um, we should teach our students to fact check information they receive. As I was talking earlier about the back propagation algorithm, ChatGPT will answer just about any question you ask it. As to whether the answer is correct or appropriate is another matter. But this also gets into learning outcomes that may be focused on critical thought, problem solving, disseminating fact from fiction, right? So our students need to learn how to actively do these things while incorporating a tool like ChatGPT. And we as instructors, again, going with that apprentice model, can learn to demonstrate that in front of our students, in front of our classes, to show your students how you would use ChatGPT to figure something out, and how you would question it or how you would fact check or verify information that it's telling you. Aaron, anything you wanted to add to this slide?
And I think, to me, building off of what Danny was saying, is thinking about that and thinking about how you can incorporate ChatGPT as a part of an assignment, as a part of something, as opposed to making like, no, you can't use that. It's almost like the forbidden thing that everyone's going to want to use then, right? You can't touch that. Like, oops, I touched it 10 times. Sorry. How do you incorporate that, demystify it? And as Danny said, how do you help them leverage that as a resource, but not as a sole production? And going back to the idea of not focusing on the actual assignment, the actual outcome, but how they got there, how they apply that critical thinking. Again, when they start looking at, say, give them a prompt, or even in prompt development and creation. I was thinking about this earlier, is, you can say, make me something good to eat. What does that mean? Right? You could say, okay, I'm going to have breakfast, and these are like the three ingredients I have, and I have 15 minutes to make it, and put that level of detail. Teaching students, and again, this goes all the way up through like PhD students that we were able to teach, is teaching them to get to the core question, to clarify in a manner that's easily consumable, because in the realities of life, that's what they're going to have to do on a consistent basis. They're not going to open their textbook and be like, oh, 302, I'm going to write this exact thing. No, they use that as a guideline to inform their critical thinking, analysis, and decision. How can we apply that in a more in-person sense? And so that's where we can leverage that. Regardless of what the answer is, we want to know about the journey on how they got to that answer.
Exactly. So this is the final slide of our presentation, creative uses for ChatGPT. These are just some practical ideas about how to immediately incorporate this kind of technology into a variety of classes. As has been mentioned, ChatGPT can be used to as a study aid. It can actually be used to create study aids. You can tell it to write a poem about ATP, right? If you're taking a biology class and you can tell it to write a sonnet about you can about any topic. You can it's a very interesting tool to use that can create certain products to help students learn things in very novel and creative ways. That previously, if you just had access to the internet and a search engine, you can't really do that. That's one of the fascinating things about generative AI technology is it can actually create something that helps you understand something. Uh, I think Aaron kind of mentioned this idea a little bit. You can argue with ChatGPT, right? I've talked to other colleagues who have actually created assignments where students are supposed to use ChatGPT, ask it questions, and then really contend with it, debate with whether they like the answer they got, to conduct their own research in parallel with ChatGPT to, compare what ChatGPT says and what they can find from doing their own research, perhaps in your college library. Um, Students can use ChatGPT to journal about their experiences and reflections. Again, shining a light on the processes that we want our students to take, having a focus on process over product in our teaching style and our teaching method. And the final point, students can use ChatGPT to generate a response and then fact check the information that's provided. Aaron, did you want to add anything?
I did, and I think while we're really emphasizing the focus of student use, I want to dial back a little bit about faculty use. Many of us write lectures. I know Danny does. I do massive lectures. Everybody loves reading it, or you love talking about it. But you're like, how can I reinforce that through a study habit? So what we've done is taken that. We wrote an algorithm to do this. You can import your narrative and say, create 5 multiple choice questions based on the narrative or lecture, or listen to my lecture that I gave, or watch this video that I gave the lecture. And as long as you have a transcript, write me questions about this. And you can do that through a cyclical process, because I know a lot of people are like, oh, everyone's cheating, just going on Course Hero and finding my answers. Well, if you continually create that through an iterative process, it increases the time to market with your actual quizzes, and also you're not depending upon what is provided by almost like a textbook company or something, and it's more focused on what you're talking about and the content that you have. And so far I've implemented that, and I know others have in the last year, just based on the tool we built to do that. And so it's really helped, not just with that, but with training of employees and just a variety of factors where we've been able to utilize that and just strengthen the classroom experience for the students. So thanks, Danny.
Thank you, Aaron. So with that, our presentation is concluded. We are about 13 minutes early, so we have plenty of time if anyone has any questions or would like to chat about anything. I see
Or,
there
may,
were some comments in the chat.
or maybe others have utilized any type of what we say like a GPT, like a Bard or anything like that, or a Bing chat to maybe enhance your classroom that you would like to share.
So I guess again, to just emphasize some of the main points of this presentation is that we're really seeking to rapidly normalize this technology and put it into an appropriate context for us to revisit sound teaching and learning principles. And as I was conducting my own research for this presentation, one thing that just came back again and again in my mind is how we already have the answers as to how to cope with ChatGPT, right? We have culturally relevant instruction. We have various pedagogies, andragogies, if you will, for how to engage students. Um, we have ways essentially to make our classes more interesting, and it's more important than ever that we do that. Right? Whether we had ChatGPT or not, as educators, we always need to be evolving. We always need to be growing. You never get to a point where you've totally like made it, right? We're all students. We're always learning, right? The more that we can model that for our students, I think the better. That learning never ends, and that we, as their professors, are continually trying to refresh our practices and what we're doing and remain grounded in reality with a sense of how to go forward for tomorrow. So again, I think, you know, with our presentation, we talked about the history of AI. We talked about the importance of understanding the community that is urging caution and care as that technology continues to develop. Um, it's very interesting to both of us, to Aaron and to myself, that a technology that is largely coming from the world of computer science and data mining has firmly entered the world of education. So you really see a sense of worlds colliding as we go forth into this 21st century and realizing that, you know, this is almost like the next stage of development of what it means to utilize the internet, utilize the online world, that it's no longer about just searching for static pages using a search engine. We now have the ability to leverage AI systems that can actually create products and deliver customized answers. But again, we want always to make sure that our students understand that their voice, their actual voice, is what is truly valued, not the voice of ChatGPT. Um, and that both educators and students need to put ChatGPT within its proper context and within its proper role. And again, the ways that we accomplish doing that are through sound teaching and learning principles, such as culturally relevant instruction and various things that we were talking about. Thank you for the comment. Appreciate that. Um, again, I guess we could ask, is there anything anyone would like to ask or share? We have a few moments, or we could, you know, end a few minutes early. I know that there's going to be a wrap-up session at 3 for today, and so, Dr. Zentner, what do you think?
So I just want to thank everybody for their time, their attention, and hopefully their willingness to go in either direction on AI and the use. Again, we're at the baby steps. We're not Olympian runners yet. It's not the resolve of everything, but just as anything, take it with caution. Take it, set your parameters on with it or without it, and really be open to how you can potentially leverage it, not just in your classroom, outside of your classroom, help operate your day to day. So I just want to thank you again, and Danny, thank you again for leading this and putting this together. It's always been fun working with you. So everybody, we
Likewise, thank you.
hope